Welcome. I'm Dan Handel, Director of Manifest Institute of the Americas. It is with great pleasure that I present today's program dedicated to Chicago-based artist Barbara Kasten. The occasion is the upcoming publication of her work in the book Barbara Kasten, Architecture and Film 2015-2020, published by Skira Editore. At the Manifest Institute, we seek to foster critical and imaginative conversations about American space and the forms and ideas which it animates. As part of that mission, we have been organizing a series of events that push the boundary of online programming with new forms and new formats. An artist and author talk dedicated to Barbara's work is such a great opportunity to test new ideas because her own work has been doing that for so long. Personally, I'm also excited to be here as I had the opportunity to meet Barbara in her studio a couple of years ago, which I was excited that she even remembered. This short visit in which she swiftly moved from a plexiglass sculpture installation to leather and to video projector to explain to me how she looks at things and how she thinks through light and color left a lasting impression. It was an impression of an exceptionally curious mind, always on the search for new forms of artistic expression. The book we will discuss here today is so interesting precisely because it highlights some of the processes behind Barbara's work, and also because it casts these works in new light, so to speak. Today, we're joined by Barbara herself and by editor Stephanie Cristello, as well as by Humberto Moro, Deputy Director of Program at Dia Art Foundation. Before I hand it to Stephanie, I want to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art and Art Design Chicago for teaming up to make it happen. And a special thank you to Tal Erez, who conceived and designed the amazing setup which you are about to experience with the help of Anna Tordera. I hope you enjoy the next hour. Stephanie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dan, and thank you to everyone for joining. Like Dan mentioned, my name is Stephanie Cristello, and it is an honor to be here as the editor of Barbara Kasten's upcoming monograph, including authors such as Humberto Moro alongside Hans-Ulrich Obrist, Mimi Zeiger, and Irina Hajduk on new scholarship surrounding Barbara's recent architecture and film works from 2015 to 2020. Without further ado, I will pass it off to Humberto and Barbara. But before I do, I just wanted to say a few thank yous. Of course, to the Graham Foundation, whose 2020 publication grant made the beginning of this research possible, and to our publisher, Skira, through Eduardo Gizzoni. Thank you also to Dan and Tal of Manifest Institute, Eva Silverman of the Terra Foundation for American Art and Art Design Chicago for their support of this program. Humberto and Barbara will be speaking about their chapter in the book, and then we'll have a brief intermission that screens a 2015 film entitled Sideways, and we'll resume the conversation with myself and Barbara before the close. So thank you so much, and off to Barbara and Humberto.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, and thank you so much, Barbara. It's an absolute honor to be here with you two in one further iteration of our professional and friendly relationship, which has filled me with joy. I appreciate this opportunity to extend our conversations to a different realm and to a different community. So thank you to every person that was involved in the organization of this cyber event. My name is Humberto Moro. I'm Deputy Director of Dia Art Foundation, and I'm broadcasting live from Dia Beacon in upstate New York. And Barbara, we have had a couple of conversations about the contents of the book with you and with Stephanie. We had a lovely meeting in your studio not long ago, around the third time in Chicago, where we had the opportunity to talk more about your practice and about your production. But I want to start our conversation with something. I sort of like started looking at my notes and the way that I build this argument that is in the book, and sort of like thinking about our conversations. And I want to start with the intention with this publication, because it's not a publication that's doing a lot of things. It's doing, I think, one thing, and that is to really unpack the multidisciplinary nature of your work, and really think about the rich relations that there are, mainly with architecture and film. And I'm wondering what it means for you to have this publication doing that at this time.
Well, I'm very grateful to begin with to Stephanie, who came up with the concept of doing a book, and to everybody who's participated, including you, of course, Humberto. And it means an incredible acknowledgement for me that my work is being seen in its kind of multi-layered presentation and intent, because I've always sort of been recognized as a photographer, which was the main issue of my work, back in the 80s. And but the concept under that work was always sculptural, and always had the undertones of what Stephanie wanted to feature in this book. So for me, it's a great opportunity to show the world, how I really think, and what the ideas are behind my work in general.
Now, just to spend a couple of minutes thinking about this issue of photography and its limits, and how there's kind of like a categorization that goes along with the medium naturally. And with your work, I feel that photography just happens to be where the medium landed, but what's really important about the work lies somewhere else. And you said something really beautiful in one of our conversations, where you think that photography doesn't necessarily is read as something experiential, and how that sort of like brings to the fore the own limitations of the medium. So I'm wondering if you can speak about how you see those limitations.
Well, the manifestation of my studio work and experience on a flat piece of paper, like a photograph, is not, to me, the goal. The goal is to experience something that cannot be experienced unless you're totally involved in the space. And the photograph is, in a way, a documentation of that experience. So I don't see it as the end goal of the process. It's not just to make a photograph. In fact, my background comes from more of sculpture, painting than it does from photography. But the association with photography came about because it is a photograph and people have labels. And so as soon as it's labeled a photograph, I'm labeled a photographer. And that's not necessarily the case. And so this is a great opportunity to kind of break out of that, mold, that label.
Now, to jump directly into our chapter of the book, which I think has been a wonderful conversation, and sort of like a parallel study that I made about your work in relationship to Luis Barragan, the Mexican architect. And it really starts with this series construct from the late 70s and early 80s. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about this series and how they came to be.
Well, it's interesting for me now to look at this photograph, and having read your essay and seeing the point that you're making about Barragan and architecture and my vision or my work. And I see this image totally differently now, but not differently in its intent, which was to deal with space and the ambiguity of space and the reflection of the environment that might not be obvious when you're standing in front of it. But I have a selected view in this photograph. And so in that view is why the photograph is important, because as I move into space to make it, I'm conscious of many aspects of that space, but the photograph then records only the one vision. And then that's kind of like where the architecture comes through, because I see where points meet. I see where there's a balance of form, all the kinds of considerations I think that an architect makes when they're designing as well. So the process is, for me, multi-layered in how I actually make the piece and record it.
Now, something that really helped me understanding the nature of this series was a specific exhibition that you spoke about in 1984 at John Weber Gallery in New York. And I think the relationship between image and sculptural elements, and then your vision of these sculptural elements, it's really condensed and represented in this show. Can you speak a little bit about how this show came to be and what's the image we're seeing?
Well, it's because this is a set that's based in the same forms and shapes of those that end up in the photograph. Some people are misled to think that the photograph is actually made in this set, but it's not the case. This is like, I made this for the sake of making a tableau, an environment that, well, more of a tableau to look at and not be involved in terms of the physicality, the way I'm involved in my own set. But it opens up the imagination as to the many angles and possibilities of the materials, the mirror and the shadow, which becomes kind of a photogram on the wall due to the lighting and the mirror projection. All of those things are in my mind when I'm creating this environment for people to see, and it's a different experience than the photograph. So it's, in that sense, it's they're like two different pieces. They're two different concepts and ideas. The goal here was not to make a photograph. It was to present the multi-layered experience of light and shadow and form, and how it makes the world topsy-turvy in a sense.
Now, to deepen a little bit in this sort of argument that I'm making about this, what I regard as two points of contact between your production and Barragan, I think that I was very forward in terms of how I was wary of not trying to read your work through the eyes of Barragan or through his work, but only to establish sort of like a parallelism between the practices, a kind of like kinship between the practices. And I think I use a very specific case, which is the Gilardi house that was built between 1975 and 1977 in Mexico City. And you know, I regard Luis Barragan to be sort of like an anomaly of male-dominated modern architecture, because he really thinks about the domestic space. He really thinks about architecture, color, and the experience of architecture in terms of emotions. And that is where this term emotional architecture comes, and it's sort of like pervasive in Barragan's mode of thinking and operating in and around of architecture. And for me, this idea that there is sort of like a reversed equation whereby Barragan creates color with space and you create space with color was sort of like the key to approach this relation. Because, for example, this house, which is still to this point very well preserved, and it's open to the public by appointment. The family that owns the house is still living there, and they have done a fantastic job in preserving the house. So you can see, for example, the light that comes in this very specific window that Barragan created, and the combination of colors, which in a way behaves in the sense that it gives a more specific account of what I'm saying, how Barragan is thinking about how he's creating color with the space and with the way that light behaves. And this house has different elements, as a patio that we saw, this hallway, and it at the very end has a pool with two very distinctive colors, the red and the blue, and a sort of like skylight that brings specific sunlights which move through the day. And to cite Emilio Ambas, who's an architect and curator who curated the architecture of Luis Barragan in 1976, an exhibition of Luis Barragan at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. He interviewed Barragan for that book, and Barragan himself says, "I believe in an emotional architecture. It's very important for humankind that architecture should move by its beauty. And if there are many equal valid technical solutions to a problem, the one which offers the user a message of beauty and emotion, that one is architecture." So he really understood the use of color, the use of space, in terms and in service of emotions and the emotions it caused in the viewers. Something kind of like a fun fact of this book, which is a catalog of this exhibition, is that it was completed by the time that Barragan was doing this house, which was his last work. So in the book, there's only a sketch of the back view of the pool, and I think it's I bring it up because it almost looks like one of your photographs. It's a very beautiful design made by Barragan. And there's obviously a couple of other constructions, earlier constructions, the Satellite Towers from 1957, which he did in collaboration with Matthias Geritz, and together they coined this term of emotional architecture. And obviously the Quadra San Cristobal, which is another construction in the outskirts of Mexico City, where Barragan himself says, in collaboration with Emilio Ambas, how with this construction he manages a lyric effortlessness, two aspects of high ritual, the suggestion of a space beyond, and even more magically, transubstantiation, a solid matter that has a liquid core. So this instability of matter is really important to me, because the series a more recent series that you have made, the progression series, Barbara, I think achieves that instability of matter as it's contrasting and confronting different visual phenomena insofar as there is an image of colors that is a representation of that view and that reality that you were seeing at the moment, in combination with actual acrylic that's creating some sort of shapes, but also I think a difference in time, because these two objects are marking a different time and they're reactive to light. So that for me is a very specific way to relate Barragan's intention with your intent in doing this work. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about this series.
Wow. Well, you just put out a lot of information that I can relate to. And I don't know that I could get to everything, but the use of color for an emotional reaction or response that I think he used, as you described, is something that I use color for as well. There's a palette that ranges from all the basic colors, all the color wheel, in fact, of color, and yet a lot of it relates to nature as well. The blue, which is reminiscent of the sky that he uses as his blue. He didn't need to paint it; it was there, and he used it. So it was like a natural kind of phenomena for him to incorporate into the architecture. And in my case, it's the natural color of the material that I chose to use. But natural sounds like, it should be of the earth, but natural is also what the material itself projects. And in this case, the material is acrylic. And formulates at the edges of a piece of acrylic to have this really highly fluorescent edge. And so those are qualities of the material that I used to make the work, as well as the step from the illusion of the photograph that then comes outward into space with the same kinds of materials. So it's not repeating the forms that are in the photograph, but it's taking those forms and that material and coming forward into space, but also utilizing the light to project through those forms and create, the shapes outside the edge that add another dimension. So it's a real blending of the material and the spatial construction of it all. And I think his work is very similar in that way as well. So, I of course knew about him, and I actually was in Mexico in the 60s, and since then too, and looked at a lot of modernist architecture, because that's always an interest whenever I travel, or even travel to make sure I see things. And so, I can easily relate to what he was thinking, and especially through the use of his color and the primary colors, for instance, in that pool area, and the reflection that comes. I mean, they're very photographic in that sense too, because he's utilizing the hallway image that you showed. He's using daylight color of blue to the warm tones that would be considered a different color temperature. So he's quite aware of, I think, all the elements that go into, a photograph as well. And it's a marriage, I think, he takes advantage of. And I hope I do too.
Sorry to interrupt, but just to be mindful of time, and because I'm sure we could speak about this for hours.
Right.
I wanna close this part of the conversation by citing yourself with something really beautiful that you said, that it really moved me and made me really understand a lot of the nature of your practice. And we were speaking about what kind of like what your work is, where it resides. And you said it's not something that one can just identify easily, because it's not a thing. It's an atmosphere, a reinterpretation of space by being in the space. an exchange of body and space that I got every time I sat on this setup I made for the camera. I experienced that space, but I was recording it. But it was hard. How do you make that experience manifest? And that was a difficulty in keeping that a photograph. So I wanted for you to respond a little bit to what you said before with this beautiful image of you working in the set to close our conversation, if you can.
Well, in a way, being in the space is a discovery of the space and of the forms that I've created. And as you know, those forms are not held together in any way by glue or anything to keep them in that shape. They're all balanced on one another. And so, you know, at any moment that could fall apart, but that could be an explosion of color that just falls flat on the surface. So being in the space and with the light projecting photograms in the space, as you can see on the wall behind me, it's a totally different experience than the one point view from the photograph. But they both add to the environment and to what I'm trying to show, that, you know, a lot of things are hidden until you really look, and until you're really in the space, you see things differently.
Well, Barbara, I want to thank you so much for being so generous with your process and for being so open and for sharing so much of your knowledge and of your life story with us. It's a true privilege to be able to have these conversations with you and Stephanie. And without further ado, we're gonna pass it on for the intermission and the interlude, and we'll reconvene with Stephanie and you after that. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Humberto, for your really wonderful interpretation of my work in relationship to a very beautiful artist and
Thank
architect.
you.
Thank you. I think it gave me an experience of space that was unique. You know, the idea of how the light and the color sort of exchange and create this special atmosphere. I mean, the light falling
into intermission
certain
now.
surfaces, and also changing the dimensionality of those surfaces by the way the light and the shape of the light that came through the windows would conform around or on top of, you know, what was inside. So, you know, it was an understanding and a reinterpretation of what it meant to be inside a sculpture, not on the outside looking at it as a complete, you know, object. It was more the experience that was so important to me. You know, I'm building these sort of installations that I'm in, moving and arranging things. And then I step out of that and I step behind the camera. So the photographs are this kind of hybrid of what I take from actually being in a space and bringing it into the camera plane. I never wanted things to be illusionistic, but I also allow the viewer to kind of come with me from one experience to another. I'm opening it up for a perception that I'm only having, and then I want to share. And it was in a way, a documentation of my performance in front of the camera. You know, to me, a work of art has to have that, that growth, that history to make it art. It's not just an object that we complete and show. It has to have life, and that's what we make it for. It's a reflection of our lives in a lot of ways. And the blue, the coloration, the blue, the intense blue, always a spiritual color. All of that was a very personal sort of journey of my own to deal with a personal loss. My father had just passed away, and but the architecture and the choice of using the architecture as symbolic of that, I think was again a very intuitive choice of, you know, of how humanity honors and preserves the dead, and has done so for centuries in different ways, like the dolmen indicate. And so one thing led to another of like looking for other structures or important indicators of an afterlife. But, you know, humanities, a kind of reference to the goddess and to women in power. I think, you know, I had to honor.
Welcome back. And for those who are just joining us, my name is Stephanie Cristello, and it is such an honor to be here as the editor of Barbara Kasten's upcoming monograph, including authors such as Humberto Moro, who we just had the pleasure of hearing, on new scholarship surrounding Barbara's recent architecture and film work. Before inviting Barbara again to share her brilliant contributions, I wanted to provide a structure for the writing that I embark on in this chapter. Focusing on installations of the last 5 years, my research really delved into Barbara's engagement with sacred sites and goddess structures from antiquity, which included churches, temples, prehistoric dwellings, and burial monuments since the 1970s. I feel like this is one way that we can understand her approach to light and space in recent installations. Across each of the works that we'll speak about, we're bathed in a sort of light that passes from the sacred into the material. This idea really came into being while looking into Le Corbusier's approach to sacred architecture, namely his Ronchamp chapel, which inspired the set that we're speaking on at this moment, and which Barbara visited in France in 1965, shortly after its construction. So we'll hear about how this experience informed your work from you, Barbara, which you've written about quite a bit, but also how it inflected how I was thinking about your engagement with not only modernist form, but also ancient temples and sites. So to begin the conversation, and what sort of started my thinking around this idea is a 1911 image of Le Corbusier that I came across while researching the Ronchamp chapel that was taken at the Parthenon at the Acropolis in Athens. In his commentary on the design of Ronchamp, Le Corbusier wrote that infinite voices from the most distant centuries reach the most intense moments of modernity. So recognizing the influence of Le Corbusier on modernist architecture in your work, you sort of reach the contemporary via encounters with antiquity in similar ways. So while the focus of this talk will really dive into your work from recent years, I wanted to start by talking about the figure of the column, and through two early works that I think draw an interesting relationship to your recent exhibitions, but also to this light that you describe at Ronchamp. And I think, given the theatricality of this talk, it would make sense to start with the collaboration that you had with Margaret Jenkins' dance company in 1985. And maybe you could speak a bit about the residency that you did at the Cap Street project in San Francisco, and piggybacking off of Humberto's conversation about the Construct series, how this was really a turning point for you in your work, the first time that you designed an actual stage set.
Well, actually, the aspect of the collaboration that sort of let me manifest an idea that had been germinating for a while, and that is motion, trying to insert some motion into this still image that I was continuing to work with as a photograph. So it was the first time I had an opportunity to sort of translate this experience of being in the sculpture, but also having the sculpture have a sense of movement that's visible to others, not just my movement that I had as I was, working in the set. So that translation of my movement, which was always a performance, but a very personal one, then could become something that I could also include for the audience to experience.
Right. And so many parts of the set too were movable to mimic how you were moving in your studio throughout the Construct series as both the first performer and witness, but also making the image unfold.
Right. And also I've always been a fashionista of sorts. And so having designed the costuming and the lighting and the entire set was a real pleasure, and it was fun besides.
And so often, just to loop back to the relationship that began to become part of the main discourse of your work, which has, I think, and we've talked about, been largely inaccurate, is your relationship or labeling as a photographer, which has also often excluded your work with spirituality and the spirituality that you reach through light. I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about your relationship to light and to the spiritual, and how, what were the first glimmers of that in your practice that you saw?
Oh, well, let's see. The spirituality, I think, of the light was sort of, it's evident when you look at nature and light, sunlight and evening, and the changing of the environment that you're in, that it's connected to something that we don't have control over. And so, just the idea that there's a universe that's beyond our control, and the fact that we are always engaged with who we are and why we're here, I think it leads a lot of the investigation that I have. It's even in the abstraction, it's like, what does abstraction do? What is it? Is it an exact, extraction of abstraction of a form that we're familiar with, or is it just come from our mind and our need to build things and put things together in our own personal way? So it's that kind of spirituality. It's not a religious one, but more one of being inquisitive and acknowledging that there's something great out there that we cannot really know, but we perceive through light in a lot of ways.
And throughout the series that you did in the 90s, quite a few series, there were, I think, in this decade, a proliferation of sacred sites that you visited that appeared in your work more so than any other decade. And one of the main series within this bracket was the Turkish Temples, and throughout the Aegean coast, cyanotypes that you made of ancient monuments. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about how you found yourself in Turkey, and how the creation of these works were inflected by other experiments that you'd had with architecture already, the architectural sites, for example, which were done in the mid to late 1980s.
Well, that question could go in so many different directions to try to elaborate. And one would be my own sort of personal search. I went to what I knew and was familiar with, which was the New Mexico Puya cliff dwelling sites, which is ancient architecture here to us in the United States. And then when I had an opportunity to be in Europe, I tried to seek out the historic sites that in more ways were related to a funerary kind of question. My father had just passed, so of course that brings up a lot of anguish and thinking about mortality and all of those aspects. So the selection of places that are historic and precede us with the use of blue, which I think of as a very spiritual color, that was easy to manifest in cyanotype, kind of led to this new direction that I followed to different sites in Europe, the temples, the Tanagra goddesses, the different objects that were also probably unknowable. I mean, we know history to a degree, but we don't know people's total reasons for building a lot of these or using these artifacts.
Right. And the remnants remain. And it's
right.
It's interesting with the color blue because, of course, it carries in your work a spiritual connotation of light, but also an architectural connotation. The cyanotype was invented by an astronomer in the 1840s and then was later adopted by architects. And that's why we have blueprints, for example. So I think that there's so many interesting connections that can take place between your approach through the color blue to describing architectural sites, but also all of the emotional and cultural influences that carries.
Yeah, that's true. And without doing, research and making that a point, it was a sort of an intuitive and natural progression to use cyanotype. I was in climates that had a lot of sunlight, and there is very experimental, and it's what I like about the cyanotype in terms of the photograms or these images is that they are negative when they're printed, and that gives it another tone of unknowing, of questioning our existence in a way and our history. So the architecture always seems to enter into my thinking in some form or another, and either in the abstraction of form, or this actually becomes an abstraction as well.
Exactly. Yeah. And that enigmatic aura, I think, is one of the main achievements of photographs that you took of temporary installations, such as in the architectural sites, which use light to destabilize buildings. And so there is this quality also of abstraction, even though these are more representational in nature. The mission of the light, I think, is to do just that.
Well, which is exactly what this does in the Ronchamp Chapel too. The light penetrating and falling shapes on on different surfaces and forms is exactly what I was doing in the studio, or what I began to do in the studio, because I saw this way before I made any kind of photograph, or I was painting more at the time. So that, you know, there's just so many crossovers in my work with architecture, from the geometry to the qualities of architecture that I try to enlist. The materials that I use are basically building materials. They're from, you know, building sites, really. So, and, you know, I don't know exactly why architecture has always been so important to me. I think I was influenced when I was younger by growing up in Chicago, but, you know, it's nothing that direct lineage. It's more like an interest in creating and building a new form, something that hasn't been seen before, hasn't been experienced before.
Yes. And in your amazing text that you wrote for Art in America just before the opening of the 2015 exhibition, which is really where the research for this book and the focus lands, is everything post your Stages exhibition at the Graham Foundation and at the Institute of Contemporary Art in Philadelphia. You wrote about the Ronchamp Chapel as an otherworldly fantasy. And there's one quote that you wrote, which is, "I felt as if I were in an intangible space, at once outside reality and deeply connected to the physical properties of light," which I think is just such a beautiful thing that carries over into the rest of your work in the following decades.
You know, in September, I'm going to be in Germany, again, not too far from Ronchamp, and my plan is to repeat that experience and see how I feel about it all. How many years later? 50?
Five decades later.
Sure, yeah. So I'm really anxious to see it again at this point in my life, and have another experience.
Yes, and you see glimmers of Ronchamp, or the experience of light in Ronchamp, in so many of your current installations, such as the Scenarios piece from 2015, which you restaged in 2020 for the Aspen Art Museum show, which I was lucky enough to get to go see with you in the most challenging of circumstances. Maybe you can talk a little bit about this exhibition, specifically the film installations, Scenarios, and Crossover. And I'll sort of leave it on this image of the previous installation viewed from the Graham Foundation in 2015.
Well, you know, it is really related to Ronchamp when you analyze it, because you're looking at a scattering of white cubes against the white backdrop, and many of those cubes that you see are actually projected cubes. So it's again a question of reality of what was the projection of light and form over the materiality and solidness of the cubes that were there. So I think that basically my work, I wanted to challenge what we see and add a new dimension to what is possible, and kind of reveal what's not seen and can be made to be part of our life experience. So this I think this movement and form changing the environment, this particular film was labeled in sections of morning, afternoon, evening, and night. So the change of colors was relevant to those times of day, and the whole experience changes, even though the form that's physically there does not. And that's kind of what I wanted to get across.
Yes, it manifests the light that you experienced at Ronchamp as this sort of memory, but through abstraction, I think,
Right.
in an amazing way. And, you know, most of the dimensionality, as you mentioned, of this work, you know, some of it comes from a projection upon blank surfaces of built form, from the cubes that are scattered along this built corner, constructed corner. But there's also other things that start to happen, which is the shadow that is cast against the backdrop by the form, which is even absent in the film. So you start to see all of these perceptual changes when you're in front of the work in ways that question a material reality.
Mm-hmm.
But nothing is illusionistic. You know, everything is the material that is there. It's just that you have this ability to sort of manifest light and perception in a way that I think most artists have not been able to achieve. And it really comes from the constructs, but also the color of these forms is imparted by the projection. And in the context of antiquity and looking at these classical ruins, I was thinking a lot also about polychromy, which is that all of the marble ruins that we see standing today that we know as classical architecture were once also adorned in plenty of color.
Right. Right. I'm not an art historian, so I didn't approach the work with all of that knowledge evident, even though I'm aware of it. And a lot of times after you make a work, you really discover more about the work as you look at it, and you start thinking about all these ideas that other people had that, you know, can be manifest in your own work, or is, and you don't even, you know, set out to do it. It's just kind of like inherent in the material of your, and light in particular, I think, because light and shadow go hand in hand, and shadow becomes such an important role in the videos and in the photographs. They create form in themselves. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think one of the aspects of the book also are to sort of draw these comparisons between, you know, to place your work in context, even though there is an intuitive way that you've worked with abstraction and architectural form, it unfolds in such different ways as we sort of look at some of your sources, at things that you were thinking about in the process of making the work that does, you know, come up at certain, I think that there's a current that runs through your approach to light that is so evident in your work from the 1990s up until the present, that hasn't yet fully been explored, but they were things that you were doing.
You know, I think I really like to keep things sort of direct and simple. So there's sort of barrowing in to the cause of the form, and the use of light is in, for instance, in the piece now that you're showing Sideways, it's really such a simple thing, such a simple concept, you know, a white structure that I built, and just the movement of light across that structure. It's very basic.
But it's also very elemental. You know, a lot of your work really digs into the essentials, the clearest, simplest way to capture a form through light that in so many ways just transforms our experience completely.
Well, see, that's why you're a writer, because you express that so well. Thank you.
But this film is really, the perception of this film is destabilizes your idea of environment. And we stood in front of it together in Aspen, and it envelops you completely. And there was one work from the 90s that I wanted to show also in relation to it, because it is this long panoramic experience that also wraps around a corner like Scenario does. But there's this composite mural that you made in 1994 of one of the burial sites, the dolmen that we talked about. That to me does the same thing. It captures this space in a way that is such a minimal gesture of light and shadow, but carries with it also the spiritual possibilities of space.
Well, I feel like I'm that monolith in the center. I mean, I
holding everything up.
Yeah, I can almost like put myself back in a space, even though that's an imaginary space because it's a composite of 3 images. It envelops me and my memory. And the fact that it's a female form in the breasts that are represented there as goddesses, I find really fascinating. And the discovery of those was, a plus. I didn't realize that those forms existed in the dolmen areas. So, yeah, it brings me back to those spaces itself.
And also to your creation of time through light. I mean, the composite image, which in the 90s at that scale was a quite magnificent feat to be able to connect all of those images and create an architecture out of their light.
Yes, that piece that you just showed is like 40 feet mural. So it's not a small form and it actually physically makes you feel encompassed by the space as well.
And I wanted to draw one more comparison, which I think is, we've spoken about as one of your key influences also in film, which is Laszlo Moholy-Nagy's light play in black, white, and gray, a film that he made from the light prop, the light space modulator in 1930. When did you first see these abstract films and how did they play into your early film work and images more broadly?
I can't remember when I first discovered those. Because my fascination with the Bauhaus began early. And in fact, even before I ended up in graduate school with a mentor who had studied at the Bauhaus, I was already looking at the experimentation that came through them. And that was the main attraction. And then the fact that, the Bauhaus, you made photographs, you made sculpture, you did dance, and everything was acceptable. And so I think that's when I really discovered Moholy. And it was a natural inclination to find out more because these forms and the shapes and the movement are so close to to the ideas I was building up. So I think it started, way before I actually picked up any kind of a camera or video. It was all also about freedom of movement, freedom of choices in media. It was the basis of my practice, really, in many ways.
Right. Abstraction as this sort of liberation also. And I just wanted to show a few more examples of the dolmen that you took in cyanotype form. And like you were speaking about, just sort of these pillars and things that hold things up. We start to see the column and the pillar reappear in more recent works. Obviously very aesthetically different, but conceptually connected in so many ways. And the idea of balancing your work, I think, is that all your work is balanced upon the weight of itself, is a concept that is what provided the architectural basis for all of the dolmen. any sort of post and lintel structure. So it really does return to the origins of architecture, the most simple ways that humans and ancient civilizations have made space since the Neolithic period, at least. And yeah, just this idea of balancing the structures upon one another. Maybe you can talk a little bit about this idea of balance and why things aren't connected in your work.
Well, because I want that flexibility, I want that mobility, I want to be able to change as the environment changes. So there's a lot of reason to not make something stable and permanent. It's really more of a challenge to always present something differently in a different environment with the same object. So everything, I mean, many of the props, I call them props in my studio, are found in the same kind, in different images, but the same props. So it seemed very, obvious that the sculptures would do that as well. And it's a challenge to see how you could put something together and not rely on an external source of attachment. So
yeah, and I think like so much of your work also, it's the structure itself is pushed to the very edges of its limit in order to be able to stand without falling. Mm-hmm. It's the same idea of perception, I think, that you see in the photographs, which have always just been to record this phenomenon.
Right.
And I think
the light that is used to project these and throw the photogram-esque sort of image on the walls or the floor is an essential part of the piece. It's not an object that can be lit in any way. It has to have a certain spotlight directed at it so that the shadows and the forms from the light are part of the piece. It's not without the light, it's not the same.
Exactly. And I feel like this work in these two installation views, this one being at your solo exhibition at Bartolomé and the previous view at the Aspen Art Museum in near darkness, really show the capacity of this work to shift and change.
Sort of looks like scenarios, time changing.
Yeah, and the shadow also, I think, is an interesting place to return to Moholy-Nagy and his photograms. And the photograms here are something that I want you to speak about as we sort of near the end of this conversation, in these photograms that you made by moonlight of amphora, which are ancient vessels that were recovered from a shipwreck dating back to anywhere between 3 and 5 BC that you encountered during your residency at the Museum of Underwater Archaeology in Turkey.
Well, they actually, the photograms themselves were made in daylight, not in moonlight, but the painting of the paper with the cyanotype chemistry was made in moonlight. So it's nature, again, is part of the process.
Yes.
And the fact that these were unearthed or came from underwater after centuries of being, submerged and hidden is sort of, the same sort of concept of like bringing light to a form and the discovery of a form. So basically, I'm doing it through the vehicle of an amphora, but it's that same experience of discovery and a point of view that isn't always easy to see. So it's sort of complex in that way.
And I just want to show a few examples more of your work here, because so many, this will clearly be in the book, but so many people have not had the opportunity to see these photograms that you made in relation to your current work. One other series that I sort of want to close out on is Hierophany, which was a series of cyanotypes that you made where even the image referent of the cyanotype is not taking a silhouette, but you're really painting directly onto the cyanotype surface as almost an abstract painting or a spill painting where the chemicals themselves make the image. Maybe you can speak a bit about what hierophany means, where you got that term and what led to these
well,
works
this
in
is,
abstraction.
going to the essential again, as you mentioned, or the elemental. I wanted to really remove as much reference to reality as possible and just let the material do what it wants to do. So these are like poured and not painted. It is, it is a nod towards stain painting because I, have used that reference of staining in the earlier cyanotypes, which I did in 1975 as well. So it's a painting kind of connection from my past. And Hierophany just seemed to be the appropriate title because of the cosmos that's sort of revealed and the depth of abstraction without there actually being anything physical to be too abstract. It is just the material and the big black hole that we know is there, but we don't know anything about it.
Right. And the term hierophany comes from the Greek two verbs, one meaning light and the other to reveal. And it is the manifestation of, the term itself means the manifestation of the divine, but it's not necessarily tied to religion. It's more of a personal spirituality that can be achieved through light.
Right.
So we have the blue and then we have fluorescence. And I feel like talking about that light again, Crown Hall is a perfect example of an engagement of light and architecture and images that you made using things balanced upon one another again. Maybe you can speak just to close out on the process of Crown Hall and balancing all of these materials together when things felt complete, when the work felt like it achieved an image in space that you achieve in so many of your films. What was that process like?
Well, it was, I had experienced Crown Hall in all of its beauty and quietness and solitude when the students are gone, and the reflection from outdoors onto the terrazzo floor. And it was a wholly different experience than the one you're looking at, which took the activity of the students and reshaped it into these sculptures, because the activities were all done, by architectural students on tabletops, which were there. So I kind of merged my sensibility and the portability or the mobility of these forms with Mies and his very beautifully constructed environment that really is very meditative, and is that the right word? But and so I wanted that to displace the original concept that Mies intended with mine and merge them into a new reality as well. So that
And-
was the basic idea behind this installation, which again changed as I worked in there. I would move things on a daily basis. So it never had a very permanent form, except at the end where I decided to walk away and let it sit for a few days.
And Mimi Zeiger, one of the contributors for the book, spends such a beautiful amount of time of meditation on Crown Hall specifically, that talks about how you sort of undo space and make space in response to the rigidity and hardness of modernist architecture. You make space undulate and move in such a special way. And I wanted to close on this image of you bathed in the fluorescent pink light, and just thank you for all of your evocations of light and how you've managed to achieve a spirituality through abstraction that I think is a singular contribution in the context of installation and contemporary art.
Well, thank you, Stephanie, for your unique perspective on my work and bringing many things to light that hadn't been spoken of. And this unique program that we're taking part in is an incredible gesture towards abstraction too. And I appreciate being part of that adventure. So
Yeah.
Thank you to everybody involved.
Agreed. Couldn't have said it better. And before we close, first of all, thank you everybody who's attended. Obviously, thank you to Dan, Handel, and Tal Erez of Manifest Institute for designing this amazing program for us to be a part of today. The Graham Foundation for the publication grant that allowed the research to be possible. Our publishers, Skira, the Terra Foundation for American Art and Art Design Chicago, and of course, Barbara's Galleries, Stefania and Claire from Bordolami, Iris and Moritz of Cadell Wilborn, Thomas Dane and Hannah Hoffman for their support in the book, which we look forward to sharing with you all in the fall. But the most of the gratitude must go to Barbara for her amazing work and being so generous in assisting with the research for everything surrounding this publication. So thank you, Barbara. Thank you, everyone. And we'll see you in the fall with a copy of the publication.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.